Hello, my name is Paul Davis. I would like to apologize, first of all, for not being present with all of you. It would have been an exceptional 3 days, I know that, to have been present with such a large and varied group of people, and in particular to discuss public procurement and the issues of small to medium-sized enterprises in a context that's probably extremely different to what we have in Ireland and certainly what's very different in the UK. I would like to thank Hedwig and I would like to thank the Kenyan Institute of Supply Management, and of course I would like to thank Malcolm Youngson, who has introduced this video, in terms of the support that has been given to me in making this presentation. I was thinking about how to do the presentation, and I thought that the best way to do this would be to do a small video podcast and to actually make it available to people both at the conference but also afterwards. And I'll also include a small blog that I'll put up on my website, so that if anybody's got questions and answers, you can certainly email me directly or come back to me to discuss. The topic itself is about public procurement, and in particular about the small to medium-sized enterprises. And really I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening here in Ireland, and I'll make that a little bit broader then in terms of what I think is happening elsewhere in the world, and then I'll grow that probably a little bit further out in terms of what I think the relevance is for developing countries and what people need to consider. I think the public procurement market is a very significant market for small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly the SME sector. Expenditure on the procurement of goods, works and services by public authorities in the EU alone represents about 19% of European Union gross domestic product. So it equates to about 2.1 trillion euros. In Ireland alone, public procurement expenditure is estimated at between 10 and 12% of gross domestic product. In today's terms, that equates to approximately 9.5 billion euros. We have a debate in Ireland, for instance, in terms of how accurate those figures are, and certainly across Europe. All we can do is make estimates. But we know it's at least that. In developing countries, public procurement will probably represent anywhere between 15 and 20, and sometimes as high as 25% of gross domestic product. So it is a significant contribution to the marketplace and to the development of the local economies. Given the value and variety of goods, works and services procured by public authorities, it provides, the public procurement market that is, provides significant opportunities for SMEs. However, according to European Commission data, SMEs themselves represent close on 90-95% of the total marketplace. Our main focus in terms of European data also seems to show that we focus on large multinationals and the ability to do cross-border trade, rather than focusing in on the small to medium-sized enterprises or even the micro enterprises that are actually working at a local level. SME participation always in the public procurement markets has remained lower than their importance in the economy. We are unsure as to why this is. We don't know whether this is a risk aversion on behalf of the buyers themselves. But factors which are consistently cited as representing barriers to SMEs include disproportionate financial criteria, setting the entry criteria at a financial size such that the small to medium-sized enterprise can't bid. The large size of contracts being tendered. Particularly if you look in developing countries, there may be large infrastructural projects, and we have a huge problem of having the development or the capacity of small local companies to bid in for that work. The same would apply in developed countries. Excessive paperwork, large volumes of paperwork that need to be submitted on behalf of the public procurer, such that when the SME is bidding in, there's an overburden of documentation, administration that they have to go through. Overemphasis on price, not looking at life cycle costing, but developing mainly price bids and going in many cases low cost, the lowest price. Bid costs, the amount of time and energy and effort that has to go in, but actually calculating that as an economic value. For small companies whereby I've got 10 to 15 employees, it may require 1 to 2 of those people full time for a period of weeks, sometimes months, to actually put together the bids and bid in. And of course, the most important part, the insufficient time to bid, not being aware of the marketplace or the opportunity to bid in. One of the difficulties in looking at the SME sector is the fact that the majority of these enterprises are actually micro enterprises. And therefore, the factors that apply to companies with in excess of 50 people do not apply to companies with less than 10 people. So even within the definition of small to medium-sized enterprises, we have a further distinguishing feature of micro enterprises. And those micro enterprises are what makes up a great majority of the local economy. These would be in very much regional areas, underdeveloped areas, and even in the cities in terms of small community groups that would look for an opportunity to bid in, but would struggle to bid in. It is recognized that the large size of public contracts is often a disincentive for SME participation in the procurement processes. 4 mechanisms have been set out that could be considered by large contracting authorities in order to encourage SME participation. So these are elements that can be put in place regardless of the large size of the contract in order to encourage the small to medium size. And these are standard, whether I'm in a developed country, whether I'm in a non-developing country. It's purely actions that maybe we can take. So first of all, subdividing the contract into lots, breaking it down in such a way that smaller companies can bid in. There are issues in terms of how we break it down. Is it regionally? Is it on the basis of price? Is it a basis of capacity? But the idea of breaking it into lots seems a very simplistic notion, but it in many cases can give access. Combinations of contractors in order to facilitate reliance on mutual financial and technical capabilities. In essence, bringing together collaborative mechanisms and consortia. We're currently working through in Ireland with our competition authority some legislation and some guidance document, particularly around consortia. We're always frightened of bid rigging, of price fixing, and organisations coming together that would create a monopoly. But we have to recognise that with the size of public sector contracts, if we don't allow them to form consortia, they will have an inability to bid, particularly for the larger size. We can look at framework agreements whereby we pick 4, 5, maybe 10, 15 contractors who go on a framework and maybe bid for price. This can offer an opportunity for an ongoing development of suppliers. There are difficulties in terms of the qualifying criteria for the framework, the financial thresholds that are required. Again, the same things that we looked at. The barriers to entry can be applied in. And of course, the standard one for politicians, which I probably am most disappointed with, but they use as an excuse and say subcontracting. So in other words, we've awarded it out to a large supplier, but we've insisted they subcontract a proportion of their business back out to local suppliers. That subcontracting one that's used by politicians and used by the public sector has to be criticized. In many ways, it is, the only way to describe it, it is an excuse to say that we've passed on the responsibility of dealing with those enterprises ourselves and passed it on to our supplier. We've got to understand that although suppliers come in and bid in, they're under no obligation to use public procurement rules themselves. In many cases, they are going to be using a competitive marketplace and they're going to be looking for the best price. And in that case, they're not necessarily going to be looking at the other considerations of public procurement, which are the social and environmental, and in many cases, the broader economic aspects. Although these 4 pieces are actively encouraged, they are seldom practiced to the extent that they can be seen as being effective at really having any increased participation level for micro enterprises. For instance, in the UK, the use of the local multiplier LM3 methodology and the setting of targets of 75% for local SME participation has forced the appliance of these mechanisms rather than the optional adoption that is currently available in Ireland. So in other words, by us seeing in the UK, for instance, where we're starting to use a particular methodology, the LM3 methodology, and again, I will get the website references put up for you. What we've been able to do and what we've been able to see is clearly the impact of forcing organizations to think about how to use these four mechanisms rather than giving them the option of adoption. And that optional adoption piece means that procurers, like most people in their day-to-day jobs, will look for the easiest option. A further example is the requirements for selection criteria. How do I actually select the actual suppliers? And they should be proportionate and objective. An example of criteria which raises issues for SMEs would be a criterion which evaluates experience. And this could be experience acquired with dealing with the public sector only. It should be noted that such a criterion is generally irrelevant and limits competition. But quite often, in public procurement contracts, we insist on it. It should also be noted that there are disproportionate financial guarantees, high qualification levels, and financial requirements. So in other words, we're creating the burdens back on the SMEs. And although these constitute an obstacle to the participation of SMEs in public procurement, more importantly, they limit competition in the future. In Ireland, for instance, we have created a number of circulars. The most recent one was a circular issued by our Department of Finance, Circular 1014, and it goes some way to acknowledging changes to be put in place. However, circulars in an Irish context are really no more than guidance document, and they in many ways do not change the behaviour or the practices of the public procurer. And there are also no penalties to enforcement. I think one of the considerations in developing public procurement is assigning this level of responsibility such that there is a penalty or enforcement clause to make public procurers react in. And that's a very difficult thing to do. We're passing accountability and responsibility to the buyer to take on delivering of policies, but it is an important element that needs to be considered. We still haven't got that right in developed countries. So in developing countries, there's an opportunity to try examine this and to see what can be done, particularly where public procurement may be at a very early stage of development. The current directives in the EU, they refer to measures aimed at combating late payments and providing for a default level of interest for late payments and recovery procedures. In Ireland, for instance, we have a 45-day rule. We must pay within 45 days. In the UK, government departments and their agencies must publish the proportion of bills paid within 30 days, and in many cases, they must have an agreed credit period. In Hungary, for instance, the tenderer is entitled to collect the money directly from the contracting authority's bank account where it is not paid within 30 days following performance. The reason we mention this particular piece because in many cases, small to medium-sized enterprises, whether in a developing economy, a developed economy, are struggling with cash flow. Public procurement is seen as a constant cash. And in that constant cash, it really is important that they are paid on time in order to maintain services. One of the big issues, one of the things that we need to consider is in public procurement, we wish to maintain a local competitive marketplace. It is one of the key criteria. And in terms of public procurement policy, that key criteria of maintaining a local competitive marketplace means we must consider cash flow. And therefore, we must consider prioritizing how we pay small to medium-sized enterprises to ensure that they remain in business. In an Irish paper, the Irish Examiner, recently on the 30th of June, it was stated that credit conditions for SMEs are deteriorating with the time it takes for firms to receive payments getting longer. According to a Credit Watch survey, the main findings from 826 respondents in the final week of June included average payment periods for SMEs in the second quarter of 2014 deteriorated from 60 to 63 days. That means a small and medium-sized enterprise is waiting over 2 months to be paid for services delivered, whether they're in private or public sector. And public sector has a huge impact on organisations that maybe have 30 or 40% of their cash flow coming in from those public sector contracts. In developing countries, this may even be higher. In the review and survey that was done, 28% of the SMEs experienced delays of 3 months or more. And that was a deterioration of 25% in the first quarter. We have a current growth rate of between 4.5% and 6% in the economy, yet we're seeing deterioration in payment terms from all small to medium-sized enterprises, thus putting them at risk in terms of building a local positive economy. In some cases, 6% are waiting over 120 days, and a net to 16% of businesses are waiting longer compared with 14% in the first quarter. This means there is a deterioration in the payment terms for organisations in the first 6 months of this year, even though we are on a road to recovery here. So if you're in an economy that's a growing economy, you do have to consider if the small to local size enterprises are not being paid on time, what constraints does that put on them developing new services, new businesses? And public procurement has a huge impact on that. 84% of SMEs surveyed, for instance, favoured a statutory 30-day payments regime with no opt-out. And it must be considered in terms of once an organisation has won a contract, we should be paying. Again, go back to that Hungary example. The supplier has the right to pull the money from the bank account within 30 days. A really key important piece for organisations to stay in business. We have to allow big businesses and agencies to continue to grow, and they can only do this by not abusing their dominant position by contracting out of the legislation. So the government for here in Ireland is forever saying that they're SME focused, yet our average credit period prior to legislation for the 45 days was 52 days, it's now 63 days. So even though we have a huge impetus and legislation in place saying this is what we should do, there is no enforcement, and not only is there no enforcement, there's no penalties for public procurers in failing to live up to this. A second area that I'd like to talk about is the idea of development of innovation. We've talked about the barriers, we've talked about what needs to be done for SMEs in supporting them, and we've talked about when they're in place, what we need to do. But one of the most critical things for a government is trying to encourage innovation inside its organisations. In July 2008, the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment here in Ireland established the Procurement Innovation Group, and it comprised representatives of industry, academia, government departments and state agencies. Its objectives were, 1, to raise awareness of the benefits of using public procurement to stimulate research and innovation. Very important. How do we get public bodies engaging in research and thus generating new products, new services? Identifying obstacles or problems in the current procurement process which impede opportunities for innovation. So yes, we recognize here are the standard barriers, but is there something else impeding innovation? Examining the potential of public procurement directives to ensure a level playing field for all innovative companies wishing to participate in public tendering. Really important. So ensuring that an environment in which the potential for innovation can be realized for public procurement, and ultimately to make recommendations on how these objectives may be achieved. The work of the group culminated in our publication of a document causing using public procurement to stimulate innovation and SME access to public contracts, and also a 10-step guide to smart procurement. And ultimately, we outlined the importance of the SME sector in the Irish economy as follows. The SME sector plays a fundamental role in contributing to economic growth and employment in Ireland. The public sector is a particularly important market for small businesses, so improving our public procurement practices by removing obstacles and boosting the involvement of SMEs. Developing a more SME-friendly approach to public procurement would allow SMEs to make the most of their potential for job creation, growth and innovation, and an increased involvement of SMEs into public purchasing would also result in higher competition for public contracts, leading to better value for money and efficiencies for contracting authorities. I have to say, disappointingly, when I talk to you all at this point, that 5 years later we have not made much progress. So the same barriers still exist. We're still looking at late payments. We're still looking at a non-recognition of SMEs. So although we're saying that clearly there needs to be a huge emphasis on developing this marketplace, there is something else missing. In a recent review that I carried out myself for Enterprise Ireland, the public agency, I noticed that there was no policy, there was no follow-up to this policy implementation, nor were there any key performance indicators set in recent procurement policies to ensure that any of the practices to date can be measured. Excuse me. I have to say this is surely wrong. It is critical that where we have developed policies that we put in key performance indicators such that public procurers can be held accountable, can be held up as professional people who are shown to be accountable and responsible for the decisions that they make. We have to ensure that those measures are such that they can be clearly seen as having a benefit for the wider economy rather than just on a price competition. Now, these are hard things to do, and they can only be done in terms of stating clearly that SME participation in the wider public sector market is critical. In the programme for public sector reform published in January 2014 in Ireland, for instance, there is less than one paragraph out of 4 pages of text on public procurement that refers to SME participation. In that paragraph, it states that the Office of Government Procurement will only address policy. Here's a real concern. In 5 years of working with the government, for all their commitments to SME, we're still not moving beyond glib statements. If me, sitting in a developed economy, looks back and says, for all the hard work that's been done, and for all the emphasis put on SME participation, what has gone wrong? Clearly, to me, the main difficulty has been the level of professionalization within the public procurement sector. When you have professionals, people who are commercially astute, commercially aware, and commercially responsible for the decisions that they are making, therefore they will ensure that policy is delivered. Where you do not have that responsibility or accountability in place, therefore the policies and the key performance indicators will not be developed to such an extent that we can track and see where their implementation has been successful, and also to get the reasons why they failed and to take action against those failures. So what's missing? Quite clearly the professionalization of public procurement. So although we hear quite a lot of procurement professionals, and we've seen quite a large development, certainly in the last 50 odd years, right across the world in supply chain management, in purchasing and supply management, public procurement is now only getting the focus that it deserves. It is, as quite clearly we've shown, the largest contributor to most economies, and it is also key to the development of competitive marketplaces. We need to develop purchasing professionals, procurement professionals that are recognized with qualifications in public procurement. If we are to see an increase in SME participation, we cannot rely on government policies to come in place. We have to take that responsibility for ourselves. I would like to be there to have this discussion on an ongoing basis, but what I have to point out to you is that you, the people who are sitting in this room listening to this podcast, have to be very clear that you are the ones responsible for developing the public procurement professional. You are the one that are responsible for developing the guidelines that they will follow and to develop the key performance indicators that they will use and the level of professional accountability and responsibility that they will take, and thus ensuring that government policy can be implemented. Without you doing that, without you taking that ownership, public procurement will be an administrative function that fails to deliver on the policies promised. It doesn't matter about the legislation. It doesn't matter about the guidelines that are in place. It can only happen if we have qualified professionals who are accountable and responsible for the delivery of their jobs. I know Malcolm will be talking to you on the global standard for purchasing and supply education, but it is critical in terms of developing a global standard that I also, in taking a lead and looking at public procurement, said the courses that we offer in private sector supply chain management need to be reflected in public sector management as well. So what I want to see is more courses come through, particularly in countries that are developing public procurement, in the area of public procurement and particularly in the area of specialisms in public procurement that are going for this global standard. We want to show people that we can lead the way. It is really critical that professionals such as yourselves lead the way in showing others how best public procurement can be done. I really am disappointed that I'm not there with you. I would like to debate this on a wider basis, but unfortunately I can't. What I'd like to do is leave you with one thought. In a profession, there are many ways of recognizing that profession, but the most obvious way is by what it delivers. Quite clearly, the benefits that a profession of public procurers can deliver is immense. It can deliver infrastructure. It can deliver social cohesiveness. It can deliver economic growth. More importantly, it can deliver jobs. Public procurement is critical in this case. I believe that people like yourselves are responsible for developing that profession, and in such, I believe that we have a lot to look forward to in the next 10 or 15 years in the area of public procurement and what can be done, and in particular in developing growing economies, but growing sustainable economies. I'd like to thank you, and I'd like maybe to hand over to Malcolm, who may take certainly some areas of interest that the IFPSM will be dealing with. Thank you.